So if you want to solve the problem, then you're going to have to address the core of the issue and not just try and find some fixes that will allow you to continue doing what you were doing before.
Welcome to the Challenging Climate Podcast, where we discuss the big ideas and controversies in climate change with leading experts. I'm Jesse Reynolds, an environmental policy specialist.
I'm Peter Irvin, a climate scientist. The climate is changing. Join us as we try to keep up.
In this episode, we speak with Maarten Albers, who reports on agriculture and food for the Volkskrant, one of the Netherlands' leading newspapers. We will focus on a major environmental story that has reshaped politics in that country, yet hasn't received much attention outside of the Netherlands.
I think what's going on in the Netherlands is really interesting because I think it might offer us a glimpse into the challenges that climate action will face as it reaches deeper into key sectors and into people's lives. So we encourage you to stay tuned as we dig into this difficult issue and consider what it means for climate and environmental politics more widely.
Maarten, thank you for joining Challenging Climate. Can you briefly summarize the nitrogen crisis that's been a key feature of Dutch politics for the last few years?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on the podcast. So the Netherlands is a big agricultural country. We are the second biggest exporter of agricultural products in the world. That's in part re-export coming in through, for example, the port of Rotterdam, but we're also just a big producer of agricultural products. And that's mostly animal products, so dairy and meat. And that comes with its environmental consequences. Chief among them is the production of nitrogen. And this nitrogen has impact on nature. In the long run, excessive nitrogen will lead to reduced biodiversity. And the Netherlands and the European Union have laws against this. So a couple of years ago, there was a landmark court case that basically put large parts of the economy to a standstill. And that led to politics debating, okay, how are we going to reduce nitrogen emissions in the Netherlands and fulfill our legal obligations to protect nature? And obviously, since farming is the main source of this nitrogen, it was also the main target for cutting down the emissions. But yeah, when the first plans were revealed, I think it led to a big shock among farmers. And it led to widespread protests, farmers blocking highways, dumping asbestos on the highways, and driving their tractors into provincial government buildings. And eventually, parties that are open to farmers' interests also becoming the largest party in the provinces and taking over government. So it's this, environmental issue that's really led to a political earthquake, I think, in the Netherlands, and that hopefully we can draw some lessons from for climate policy.
How does artificial nitrogen impact the environment?
So I dropped chemistry as soon as I could in high school, but I'm going to try to explain this. It's not necessarily nitrogen itself, but nitrogen compounds such as ammonia and nitrogen oxides, and they're nutrients. Some plants like them and some plants don't. So, for example, brambles and nettles and grass, they grow really well in environments where there's an excess of nitrogen. But that also means that plants that don't really do well in environments with an excess of nitrogen will be overgrown by those other plants. And so, for example, in the Netherlands, you have a lot of infertile, nitrogen-poor soils and natural environments. And the excess of nitrogen there means that the typical plant species that appear there will disappear because these brambles and nettles are doing so well. And that also means that the insects, the pollinators, and the birds that, again, depend on them also disappear. And so you get only the species that do really well in nitrogen-rich environments that take over and take away this unique qualities of the natural areas that we have.
Am I right that there's also an issue with water as well? So that if the nitrogen-rich water, that changes its properties too?
True, yeah. So some of the nitrogen also leaches into the groundwater and into surface water. And that really stimulates the growth of algae, and it leads to a lack of oxygen in the water, which then again is really bad for all the fish and all the other things that are living in the water.
And so while this is bad news for a lot of natural ecosystems, it's very important for farming. In what ways are farms responsible for this nitrogen pollution?
The largest source of nitrogen is livestock farming. So if you look at the nitrogen that's being emitted in the Netherlands, about 2/3 of it, so we're not talking about nitrogen per se, but about nitrogen compounds such as ammonia and nitrogen oxide. About 2/3 of the nitrogen emitted is ammonia, and 90% of that ammonia comes from farming. With nitrogen oxides, the picture is a bit different. Farming is only responsible for a couple of percentage of that emission, but the nitrogen oxides are also much less damaging to nature than ammonia. And additionally, ammonia, when it's emitted, it lands very close to the source of its emission, whereas the nitrogen oxides, they spread around much further in a larger area. And so the problem really comes down to livestock farms usually being in rural areas, of course, and being close to nature protected areas. And the ammonia that they emit lands in those nature protected areas.
Yeah, so the Netherlands is a relatively small country and very densely populated. This problem is not unique to the Netherlands, but is it particularly extreme there?
Yeah, so I looked up some things to compare it also, maybe for American listeners. We have 3.8 million cows here, which is a bit more than in the state of Wisconsin. Even though Wisconsin has 4 times as much land as the Netherlands and only a third of the human inhabitants of the Netherlands. So I think that gives a bit of the picture of how many cows we have here. And I wouldn't say it's the only place where this is an issue. There are also other areas in Europe, such as the west of Germany, Belgium, the north of France, and the north of Italy, where there's really heavy livestock industries. And nitrogen pollution is also an issue for nature in those areas. I think the main difference is that there have been a number of environmental organizations that have really won landmark legal cases up to the highest judicial body in the Netherlands, the Council of State, which has put this issue on the political agenda. And in some of those other regions or countries, that just hasn't happened yet. But I mean, it could happen in those places as well. Yeah.
So, Maarten, how did this become a nitrogen crisis in the Netherlands? How did this move from a background level of pollution to something that was of political salience with significant impact of policy on many farmers?
Yeah, so I think nitrogen and the issue of what to do with all the animal manure that we're producing has been on and off the political agenda for decades, but it's never really been solved or been addressed sufficiently. And it has been ebbing and flowing into political prominence for a long time. But this most recent episode really started in 2019. So I just mentioned the environmental organizations that won a big court case in May of 2019. So that's just over 5 years ago. And the court basically said that the way that we're giving out permits for farmers is not in line with the Birds and Habitats Directive of the European Union. That Birds and Habitats Directive basically says that governments should do everything to avoid deterioration of natural habitats and the habitats of species. And when those directives were put in place in the 80s and 90s, the Netherlands realized, the government here realized, that the greatest risk to deterioration in the Netherlands of natural areas is an excess of nitrogen. So they said, we will use nitrogen pollution as a measurement to avoid deterioration of nature. And what they did in the earliest part of this century is they said, we will allow farms to emit nitrogen and more than they did before, but we will put in place policies that will basically compensate for this extra emissions at a later date. And the governments basically took responsibility and said, we're going to take these compensatory measures, but they didn't act on it, or at least not sufficiently. And so the court saw this and they said, well, you're allowing all these livestock farms to produce more and more nitrogen, but you're not taking the necessary measures to prevent more nitrogen ending up in nature. And so the whole system of giving out permits to livestock farms was basically annulled by the court, which made 18,000 projects come to a standstill. And that wasn't just farms, it was also a lot of construction projects, farms, and even festivals that suddenly couldn't be organized anymore. Because in transportation, that's one of the main sources of nitrogen oxides. And so if you're organizing a festival, a lot of people drive there by car, and that's also in your permit as a festival that you can do these emissions, but suddenly that wasn't possible anymore. And that sort of made it an issue to the whole economy and put it on the political agenda.
I want to step back to a small point you mentioned there in passing, and that's the measures of compensation. What sort of activities was the Dutch government envisioning as compensation for pollution in year X that 5 or 10 years later the government would ensure? Would they be taking up the pollution? Would they be establishing protected areas, closing down farms? What?
I'm not entirely sure, but I believe that they were thinking of changing the way farmers, for example, feed their cattle. So if you change the balance of feed, then they will emit less nitrogen. You could also think of what they're also looking at now is end of pipe measures, like what are they, air scrapers or manure scrapers. So they basically technological fixes that make sure that less ammonia escapes from the barn where you're keeping the cattle. And they would want to make that more attractive to farmers to install these kinds of measures. But they didn't really put enough force behind those plans to make them actually yield a result.
Okay, got it. So back to 2019, there was a court ruling that said that the Dutch government needed to more aggressively regulate nitrogen, and their existing permitting system was inadequate. So you mentioned 18,000 projects, many of which, but not all of which, were agricultural in nature that had not been or should no longer be properly authorized. So how did this put farmers in a bind? Was it that some percentage of farms were essentially no longer legal or had to undergo some sort of extra review or application for permitting? What did farmers have to do in 2019?
Yeah, so there's a small group of farmers, I believe it's about 2,500 or 3,000 that got not a new permit, but a sort of new agreement with the government under this previous system that was struck down by the court, where they could enlarge their farm, but by a small manner. So for example, they would take on 10 or 20 more cows. And because the impact of that on natural areas nearby was so small, the government said, we're not going to give you a permit, we're just going to allow this, and we're going to note it down, and we will compensate for it later. And so those farmers were suddenly basically in an illegal position because on their permit, it listed an amount of nitrogen emission that they were over, and that they previously had an agreement with the government that they would be allowed to go over it. But suddenly that agreement was basically nullified by the court. So those farmers, for pretty much all of them, there's still not a solution. And provincial governments are, in principle, supposed to act against these farms, but they don't want to because, of course, it's not the fault of these farmers that they've been put into this situation. But there are ongoing legal cases by, again, environmental organizations to force the provincial governments to actually do something about it. In the meantime, what it means is that at least these farmers can't really do anything. They can't invest into their farms because banks are basically not lending them any money. It's, of course, a very uncertain situation that they're in. They can keep doing what they do for now, but it could be over in a year and they can't really change anything about that. So that's a very direct problem for some farmers. And for others, it's just that this whole issue put up a lot of question marks around their future in general. And a lot of the ideas that have been floated, for example, the first idea that was floated by a member of parliament of a party in government was basically to halve the amount of livestock in the Netherlands. And of course, that would have huge implications for basically any livestock farmer. And just the fact that they're talking about these kind of measures really scared a lot of farmers.
So on the issue of the political reaction, there was a sharp response among farmers, and my sense is it's not just the farmers who were affected. And to give a sense of the magnitude, Google tells me that the Netherlands has 50,000 farms. And so if we're talking 2,000 to 3,000 were essentially in a state of legal limbo. They were sort of illegal, but sort of grandfathered in, at least in some form. That's 5% of the farms, that's a significant number. But the farming community as a whole in late 2019 reacted politically as a whole. What happened?
Yeah, so I think this idea of having the amount of livestock really was a wake-up call for many of them. You should also understand that farming is, to many people, not just a profession, but it's really a lifestyle, and it's a big part of their identity. It also means that within the farming community, there's usually a bit of a feeling of us against the world, and we know best, and we don't want outsiders coming to tell us what we're doing wrong and what we're doing right. And at the same time, for decades, it's been the case that governments are more and more looking at, okay, how can we improve the way we're farming? How can we decrease the environmental impacts of farming that has come along with a lot of regulation, which has always annoyed farmers. I think that's not a new thing, and that's probably also not unique to the Netherlands, but it is the context in which this is happening. And I think that then as soon as you're starting to say, well, maybe we should halve the amount of livestock, and that's only one member of parliament of a ruling party, but it certainly wasn't government policy. But I think that just made a bell go off in a lot of the farming communities, like, wait, we should take action now before this actually becomes policy and before they are going to basically end the way that we are making a living right now.
So I remember in the fall of 2019, so bringing the years back, this was right before COVID, about 4 months before COVID broke out, there were farmer protests in the Netherlands. I think they started in October. I don't recall seeing anything like this before in the Netherlands. Am I right? How new of a development is this for this type of action where tractors were blocking roads and taking over the field in The Hague near where Parliament meets and so forth, and speaking loudly and protesting?
Yeah, I think especially the blocking highways was really unprecedented, and we've not seen that before. We've seen protests before by farmers. As in many other regions of the world, agriculture has really scaled up since the Second World War. So a lot of farms have had to stop because they just weren't economically feasible anymore. And in some cases, farmers blamed that on governmental policy. And in the past, that has led to protests as well. But that it was so visible, and also that so many civilians were impacted by these protests, I think that really made them unique. We had, indeed, at the end of 2019, we had the longest traffic jam ever in the Netherlands because tractors were blocking all highways basically on their way to The Hague. And I think that made it from political issue that impacted some part of the country to something that really everyone was talking about, whichever side you were on. The interesting thing is also that a lot of civilians were obviously negatively impacted by all the disruption, but certainly in the beginning, it didn't mean that civilians were negatively positioned towards farmers. Like, a lot of them understood the concerns that the farmers were bringing forward, even though they were doing it in a way that was hindering the rest of the country.
And since then, there's been a few elections where this issue has played a significant role. After the farming protests began in 2019, there was, if I remember right, a general election and then a provincial election, which are the two main categories of elections that are held in the Netherlands. How did this shape party politics in the Netherlands?
Yeah, so there's one party that really stood up for farmers' interests, which is Boer-Burgerbeweging, or the Farmer Citizen Movement. They're actually founded in November 2019, so very shortly after the outbreak of these protests. And they got their first seat in parliament in 2021. So those were elections basically in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And they came out of nowhere, but they managed to get one seat, with mostly backed by farmers. But not only, because you have to have about 70,000 votes in the Netherlands to get one seat in parliament. And as you said, there are about 50,000 farms in the Netherlands. So, I mean, including partners and children and maybe other relatives, there are more than 70,000 people involved in agriculture, but there are not 70,000 farmers probably. And they really got wider support among the rural population. And then their big breakthrough became 2 years later, actually, in March 2023 at the provincial elections. And you have to understand there that provinces really play a central role in this issue because they have a lot to say about agricultural and nature policy. And basically, when the government thinks of some measure, usually it comes down to the provinces to execute that measure. And back then, the whole debate was around forced farm buyouts and a deadline for halving emissions. So a previous government had said, we want to halve nitrogen emissions by 2035. And the government that was in place then said, no, we want to take this forward to 2023. And those were two very sensitive issues. I guess the forced farm buyouts even more so, because voluntary buyouts where the government can bid on your farm and you can say yes or no is one thing. And a lot of farmers are against that already because they don't want to see their profession being bought out, basically. But forced is even way beyond that. And basically, on the back of that whole debate, the farmer citizen movement, which had only existed for 4 years and had just one seat in parliament out of 150, suddenly became the largest party in all 12 provinces. And since the provincial parliaments also elect our lower house of parliament, they also became the largest party there. So really a very significant force in Dutch politics.
I didn't follow it super closely at the time, but I certainly remember being quite shocked that a new party that had existed for 4 years had been elected the largest party. Now, this wasn't in the main chamber of parliament that then produces the prime minister, so it wasn't that the party produced a prime minister. It may have been an artifact of the fact that it was the provincial elections where these land use policies are much more relevant. Did this new party remain a one-issue party, this BBB, the Farmer Citizens Movement, or was it able to get some traction by saying we have other issues, other concerns besides the nitrogen policy and the impact on the farmers?
Yeah, they certainly wrote down some of the other ideas that they had for the country, but they were far from as fleshed out as their ideas about farming and rural policy. They developed ideas of the economy and about democratic institutions and about a lot of other issues. But what you saw, for example, in 10 out of 12 provinces, they also came into the provincial government. And the first thing they did there was claim the agriculture portfolio within government. And what I've also understood from the negotiations, so also in the provinces in the Netherlands, you also always have to form a coalition with other parties to form a government. And what I've understood from those negotiations is that outside of the agriculture and nitrogen issues, the BBB didn't really put down a lot of demands on the table. And obviously, in a lot of cases, they also didn't have a lot of experienced politicians among their ranks. So it was already a big challenge for them to do these negotiations and to get what they wanted for their voters. And I think if you read the agreements, then you see that in terms of agriculture, they got what they wanted. But in other areas, they didn't really move the needle very much.
Taking a slightly broader perspective here, I can kind of see how from a farmer's perspective or for a popular perspective, this all might seem a little absurd. You know, you've got a wholesome farming doing what they've always done, contributing to a kind of invisible problem that is then, you know, the full weight of regulation is now dropping on these farmers, blocking them from doing anything, impacting the organization of festivals and so on. How has all this affected how science itself is seen, environmental regulation, and the EU? Is this leading to a broader reaction in society?
Yeah, for sure. So what I also found interesting when I was, again, going through the history of this was that one of the first protests, so you had a big protest in The Hague, and then one of the first ones after that was at the Institute of Public Health and Environment, which is basically the institute that also developed a model that calculates the emission and deposition of nitrogen. So it, for example, it calculates, you put in the amount of cattle that you have and the type of barn that you have, and then it calculates how big the impact of your farm is on nearby natural areas. So that's of huge consequence to farmers. And immediately you saw that they were taking aim at this institute. And I think any scientist will admit that the model that they're using has its uncertainties and that it's maybe not as well suited for some of the things that it's being applied for right now. But as all of them will also say, it's the best thing we have right now. We don't have anything else, you know, but these uncertainties became a big issue. And at some point, it's understandable because if this model is making calculations based on which some farms are being bought out, then yeah, that's a big thing. So certainly the way that part of the population looks at science has been impacted. Yeah, and as for views of the EU, Euroscepticism was already a thing in the Netherlands. We voted against the European Constitution in 2005. In 2016, we had a referendum on an association agreement with Ukraine from the European Union, and the population voted no. And that was also really an anti-EU vote, so it was already present, but it has certainly increased since the nitrogen rulings, because they're basically referring to EU regulations, you know, the Birds and Habitats Directive. And it's led to this feeling of the EU meddling in internal affairs. And being anti-farmer. And I think you've seen that more widely in the past years in Europe. You know, the EU has launched the Green Deal. As part of that, also a farm to fork strategy that's aimed at making agriculture more sustainable. And in the past year or so, that's become more and more polarizing issue. And there's been a lot of agitation against all the green ambitions of the EU, you know, and not just on the part of climate, but also in sort of environmental and agricultural policies. What you've heard a lot in the Netherlands the past couple of years is, you know, either about the EU or also the national government, you know, they're just bureaucrats. They're thinking in spreadsheets. They don't leave their desks. They don't know what it's like to be on a farm. They don't understand how this works. That's definitely a feeling that's become more prominent in the last couple of years.
Did this have an effect on, or did it dovetail, shall I say, with how the segments of the population viewed the response to COVID? Because the timing is similar. And if my memory is correct, it was the same institution for public health and the environment that was also overseeing the vaccine rollout and the social distancing and other measures to stop the spread.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think they definitely played into each other's hands, you know. And what was also interesting to see during the COVID pandemic is that the more fringe and extreme parts of the farmers' movement allied themselves to the fringe and extreme parts of the anti-lockdown movement. And they really found each other in some way in their skepticism towards science and towards science-based policy. Yeah.
Has this fed into populist politics in the Netherlands? Has it been taken up as a cause?
Well, it's hard to say. I think, yeah, for certain, it's had an impact. So the interesting thing is that we also had national parliamentary elections again last year in November. And there, the farmer citizen movement didn't really do so well. They got 7 seats out of 150 when just half a year before they were polling at about 30. But the big winner, as a lot of people might know, was a far right party, the Freedom Party, that has never really made a priority about agriculture and the nitrogen issue. But if you ask them, they're taking roughly the same line as the farmer citizen movement. And yeah, I think the whole farmers' protests and the COVID pandemic as well created an environment where criticism of science and of governments and of elites and of the established parties became so much more generalized and so much more public that, yeah, it's not illogical that in that environment, populist or far-right parties start to do better.
So again, thinking broadly here, this is, you're saying the Netherlands, the court system has passed a number of rulings about what has to be done. Then the national government passes that down to regional governments. But those court decisions are coming from decisions made at the EU level. How much of the higher level, how much has the EU heard these challenges and concerns? And are they able? Are they willing? Are they listening? Can they flex on this?
No, they're not really moving at all. I think also because, you know, the Netherlands is just one of 27 members of the European Union. And for us, it's the birds and habitats regulation that's leading to problems. And other countries will have other EU regulations that they struggle with. I mean, the Netherlands has always been very hawkish on, for example, financial policies. And we've been telling member states that have less frugal financial policies to spend less. And if the EU is going to listen to every single country that has issue with specific regulations, then there won't be an end in sight, you know. So the EU hasn't really moved. Of course, that might change. We've had European elections recently where far-right parties won slightly, not so much as what was expected, but that might change some things. But also in the EU, these processes all take a very long time. You know, it can take years before something is changed. And just recently in the EU, the nature restoration law was passed, which will probably put additional emphasis on protecting natural areas that we have now and restoring them. So even if you get rid of the Birds and Habitats Directive, the situation doesn't get much different.
Are you aware of how cooperative, formally or informally, this movement in the Netherlands has been with similar movements in other European countries? The one that comes to mind, of course, are the Yellow Vests protests of France. But there's also a sort of a background level, if you will, of skepticism that seems to be growing across Europe, of the EU, of elites, of technocracy. Do you think that the BBB, the Farmer Citizens Movement, is formally or informally part of this wider movement?
For the BBB, I would say no. So, for example, in the European Parliament, they've joined the European People's Party, which is a center-right group that really puts them among the more established parties. That was an interesting choice. They could have also joined for example, European Conservatives and Reformists, which is more towards the far right. For example, the Brothers of Italy of Giorgia Meloni are part of that group. But they chose the European People's Party because they thought that it would be more useful for them to join the EPP, which has historically presented itself as the protector of farmers' interests. And they basically said, we hope to steer the EPP again more towards prioritizing farmers' interests. And better join them than fight them, basically. For some of the protest movements, for example, you have the Farmers Defense Force, which was one of the main protest movements of farmers. They opened a branch in Belgium where they've actually also had legal and political issues emerging from nitrogen pollution. And they have contacts, I think, in Poland and Germany and some other European countries as well. And they did a protest at the beginning of June, just before the European elections in Brussels. So they've certainly joined forces with other fringe farming movements across Europe, but it's really confined to agriculture right now.
I'd like to steer the conversation a bit more widely than the Netherlands and nitrogen and start thinking about what this means for the typical topic of conversation here on our podcast, which is climate change. And the reason I was particularly interested in this issue, not only is it an environmental issue that I read about in the Dutch news that I don't see much coverage outside of the Netherlands, but it strikes me as potentially having some relevant lessons for climate policy as we look toward a future of planned, increasingly stringent emissions cuts. What's your takeaway, if any, from the nitrogen crisis in the Netherlands for what it may mean for the future of climate change policy?
Yeah, I think there are a few. Maybe the first one and the most important one is to be on time. As I said before, the Netherlands has been dealing with this issue of nitrogen pollution, excessive manure for quite a while now, for decades really. And they've always tried to solve it without really solving the core of the problem, which is intense livestock farming. That's the source of the emissions. And they've tried to do it with voluntary measures. They've tried to do it with end of pipe measures, but it never really solved the core of the problem. And that means that in the end, the problems get worse. And you're asking farmers to invest in technologies or to change in certain ways and saying that that will solve the problem for now. But if you then realize 10 or 20 years later that it's actually just bought them a bit of time, and 20 years later the problem is even bigger than before, you're going to have a very difficult message to sell.
That first lesson that you mentioned, you said you had 3 lessons to draw, but I do want to dwell on that one for just a moment, because that strikes me as very similar to much of climate policy, where there's this objective out there of net zero with an assumption that carbon dioxide removal technologies in particular will ramp up at a scale that's never been seen within a few decades. And then after that, reach net negative emissions, which is what I think of earlier in the conversation where we were talking about compensatory measures. It's really a vision of this compensatory measure later. It's a little bit of kicking the can down the road. Perhaps it's a lot of kicking the can down the road, but it strikes me as something to think about being on time. What was your, I think you said you had 3 analogies or lessons that you drew. What was your second one?
Yeah, it connects a bit to what you just said. It's don't count exclusively on techno fixes. I've mentioned some of these end of pipe measures that were being floated in the past and that are still being presented as the solution. And they're being presented as the solution because basically they allow the current model of farming that we have to continue. Intensive, large scale livestock farming only works if you can put all the cattle in a barn and you put an air scraper or a manure scraper and make sure that no ammonia escapes from the barn. But these measures are usually quite expensive. They don't work for everyone. If you have a less intensive farming system, then it's just economically not interesting to invest in them. And what has also become clear is that they don't work as well as expected. So the developers of these technologies often test them in ideal conditions. And it turns out that when a farmer has installed them and he no longer has the incentive to make sure it works as well as it can, it does not reduce the amount of emissions by as much as promised. So what's happened now is that some farmers have invested in these technologies, and in successive court cases, the judge has decided, well, it's not working as well as it should, so we're going to annul your permit, and understandably, the farmer is going to get angry at the government. He's saying, well, you've told me to install this machine, and now I'm still in trouble. What's going on here? So if you want to solve the problem, then you're going to have to address the core of the issue and not just try and find some fixes that will allow you to continue doing what you were doing before.
Yeah, my sense is that hasn't yet been as much of a problem with emissions policy as it has been with nitrogen. I mean, there's often concern, particularly in Pete and I, we work in a policy area around some more speculative technological approaches to reducing climate change risks. But my quick reading of emissions and emissions technology, and I'd like to get Pete in on this, is that a lot of the mitigation technologies in CO2 emissions in particular have turned out to be better than expected. And I'm thinking particularly about the dramatic drop in solar and to a lesser degree, wind. Now, of course, that's had a limited impact because there's a lot of emissions that aren't CO2, right? 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a lot of CO2 emissions that don't come from electricity generation. Pete, am I on track here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the technologies have developed farther and faster than everyone thought. I guess with a solar panel, it's not going to emit CO2, whereas with I'm imagining some kind of sieve on the back end of your building, it might get clogged up, and so the machine might fail to work, and the farmer might not notice or care or whatever. It's a kind of a maintenance issue rather than a technology issue seems to be part of it. And if your roof is leaking or whatever, something is off, then the real world might be not match the ideal world in this case.
No, you're right. But it does maybe apply to what Jesse was referring to before, the CO2 capture technologies that aren't really there yet, that are still being developed. But in some way, we are counting on them already to get us out of trouble in a few decades, maybe.
So, Maarten, let's move on to your third analogy or lesson from the Dutch nitrogen crisis for climate policy.
Yeah, that's a really simple one, I think. And that is reward those who do well and don't reward those who are not doing well. So there's, of course, a very powerful principle, I think, in environmental policy, which is the polluter pays. And in the nitrogen crisis, we've not stuck to that. So the largest emitters of nitrogen are now being offered farm buyouts. And of course, farmers don't like that. But it's also a very weird principle that if you emit a lot of nitrogen, you can suddenly get a buyout. And it's often the smaller farmers that are now actually in trouble because, for example, they belong to this group of 3,000 farmers that increased their emissions by a small amount and thus are now in legal limbo. And at the same time, you have all the farmers' movements who sometimes rather violent protests made sure that no harsh measures were taken against them. And they sometimes resorted to science denialism, and it was never that clearly refuted. And often politicians bowed to their intimidation and their pressure. And though that's understandable, because the police at some point also couldn't really stop the tractors going down the highway, I think it sets a very dangerous principle that if you cause plenty of disruption, you can basically get whatever you want. At some point, new measures were being discussed, or basically Parliament was discussing about the future of agriculture. And our Minister of Agriculture said we have to do everything to make sure we don't get our highways full of tractors again. And that basically means that you're saying we've surrendered to intimidation. And I think that's a very dangerous precedent.
That's interesting. And I'm wondering here about the politics of sympathy and demonization, in the sense that the farmers' movement represents, as we said, about 50,000 farms. I mean, there are 50,000 farms in the Netherlands, and the farmers' movement claims to speak for many or all of them. And you add in spouses and family members, and you could get 100,000, but that's in a country of 17 million people. But my sense is farmers are sympathetic. there's a sense among the much of the wider population that they are a segment of the working class. They're producing food. It's something to be sympathized with. And I'm not aware, at least, of environmental groups demonizing farmers as a class, portraying them as the bad guys. Of course, there's corporate farms, they're bad, but farmers as a category, no. In contrast with what we see in the rhetoric around climate change, that the oil companies and the fossil fuel industry, they're bad. I mean, of course, the truth is we all produce fossil fuels every time we move ourselves through one means of transportation or another and use electricity and so forth. Is your sense that the farmers' movement was able to get wider sympathy from voters, particularly in the provincial elections of 2023, through that image of the stoic farmer producing food for the wider community?
Yeah, certainly. I think that played a big part. I mean, as I said, they engaged in some very disruptive and sometimes violent protests, dumping asbestos on the highway or setting fire to hay. And I think any other social group that would engage in such protests would find a lot of people on the opposite side. But about farming, yeah, a lot of people who didn't grow up on a farm hold some quite romantic notions about what it's like to be a farmer. And I'm not saying that that's never true, but in a lot of cases, these intensive livestock farms, it's not really like that anymore.
Yeah.
If you see a picture of a farm in a children's book, there's one cow, one goat, one sheep, a dog, and a horse, and the farmer is growing some crops. And obviously, that's not the reality anymore. All these farms are specialized into either cattle or pigs or crops. So, yeah, it's become a very industrialized profession. But I think a lot of people still see it that way. And I think the narrative also of a farmer standing up against the outside world who's trying to take his profession away from him is a very powerful one and one that really rings quite strongly among a lot of people.
I realize in this conversation, I think we've spent the entire time talking about the production side of the equation here, and you've said that the fundamental issue that sooner or later they will need to grapple with is that there's just too much cattle production, too much livestock production in the Netherlands. And so I'm wondering how much of this is for export, and to what extent will the Dutch just need to eat less meat to solve this problem?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at dairy, I don't have the exact numbers right now, but a significant amount of the dairy that we're producing here goes abroad. And, I think people, at least in the Netherlands, often say, well, we shouldn't be producing milk powder for China. And yeah, that's a crazy example. But most of the dairy we produce goes to countries that are nearby. So Germany, Belgium, France. And a part of it goes to Asia or Africa. But yeah, I think if as a citizen you think this is a big issue, then it makes a lot of sense to cut down on how much dairy you're eating. But since a lot of it's for export, yeah, the same goes for consumers in other countries.
Our guest today on Challenging Climate has been Maarten Albers, who is the reporter for agriculture and food for the Volkskrant in the Netherlands. Maarten, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for listening. Please rate or review us on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere, and consider supporting us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/challengingclimate.